A man can run from his sins, but they always know exactly where to find him. The morning frost still clung to the windows of Memo's diner when Marcus Valdez found the razor. Table 7 sat empty, as it had every morning for 11 years. But today, something glinted against the red vinyl booth. The antique straight razor lay open, its ivory handle catching the pale Montana sunlight. Engraved along the blade were 3 words that made his blood turn to ice: "Para mi hermano." Memo's hands trembled as he recognized the inscription. Only Griselda Blanco herself had ever called him brother, before she discovered he was the one feeding information to the DEA, before her empire crumbled, before she died in a hail of bullets on a Medellin street corner. He'd watched her funeral on television from this very diner, finally allowing himself to breathe after a decade of looking over his shoulder. But dead women don't leave calling cards. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Memo spun around to find his waitress, Sarah, hanging up her coat. She smiled, oblivious to the weapon that had just shattered his world. Memo slipped the razor into his apron pocket, his mind racing through impossible explanations. Had Griselda's sons finally tracked him down? Was this a message from surviving cartel members, or was something far more sinister at play, something that connected to the classified files he'd helped the DEA obtain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Morning, Mr. V," Sarah called out, unwinding her scarf. At 23, she possessed the kind of optimism that only came from never having your past chase you across state lines. "Roads are getting slick out there. Jimmy's already put down salt on Main Street, but folks are driving like it's their first snow." Memo forced his usual smile, the razor's weight burning against his hip. "Coffee's fresh. I'll get the grill started." He'd hired Sarah 2 years ago when she'd blown into town with nothing but a beat-up Honda and dreams of saving enough money for nursing school. She reminded him of his sister Elena, the same stubborn determination, the same laugh that could light up a room. Elena had been dead for 15 years now, another casualty of the life he'd left behind. The morning routine usually grounded him. Flip the grill, check the coffee urns, arrange the day's specials on the chalkboard. But today his movements felt mechanical, disconnected. Every few seconds his hand drifted to the razor, confirming it was still there, still real. The breakfast crowd trickled in right on schedule. Old Pete Morrison claimed his usual spot at the counter, complaining about his arthritis and the weather in equal measure. The Henderson twins grabbed their corner booth, textbooks spread between plates of scrambled eggs as they crammed for their community college exams. Sheriff Barnes pushed through the door at 7:30 sharp, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. "Usual, Tom?" Memo called from behind the counter, grateful for the familiar script. "Make it 2 eggs today," Barnes replied, settling onto his stool. Long night. Had to deal with that domestic situation out on Copper Creek Road again. He studied Memo's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 20 years reading people. "You look tired, Marcus. Everything all right?" The question hit closer to home than Barnes could know. Memo had always been careful around law enforcement, even small-town sheriffs who spent more time mediating neighbor disputes than chasing criminals. Old habits died hard when you'd lived on both sides of the law. Just the usual insomnia, Memo lied, cracking eggs onto the grill. "You know how it is." Barnes nodded, but his gaze lingered. In a town of 800 people, everyone noticed when something was off. Memo had built his new life on being unremarkable, reliable Marcus Valdez, who made the best coffee in 3 counties and remembered how everyone liked their eggs. Not Memo Valdez, the accountant who'd helped launder millions in cocaine money before his conscience and fear had driven him to the DEA. The razor seemed to pulse against his leg as he flipped Barnes's eggs. 3 words in Spanish that transported him back to a Miami penthouse where Griselda Blanco had first used that term of endearment. She'd called him her brother while planning executions over breakfast, while counting blood money, while trusting him with secrets that could topple governments. "Para mi hermano," for my brother. The same words she'd whispered to him the night before his testimony, when she'd still believed his loyalty was absolute. The night he'd realized he was in too deep to ever climb out clean. Sarah bustled past with coffee refills, her presence an anchor to the present. This was his world now. Small-town Montana, where the biggest crime was teenagers toilet papering houses on Halloween, where he could pretend the blood on his hands had washed clean somewhere between Miami and the mountains. But someone had found him. Someone who knew about Table 7. That detail gnawed at him more than the razor itself. In Miami, Table 7 at Versailles Restaurant had been where he'd met his DEA handler, Special Agent Catherine Reyes, always the same table, always at the same time. A security protocol that had kept them both alive during the 18 months it took to build the case against Griselda's organization. No one else should have known the significance of that number. Reyes was dead, killed in a car bombing 3 months after Griselda's arrest. The case files were sealed, yet someone had chosen Table 7 specifically, had placed the razor there like a calling card designed just for him. The breakfast rush continued around him, but Memo felt like he was watching it through glass. These people, his customers, his neighbors, his carefully constructed family, had no idea they were sitting a few feet away from a man whose past could get them all killed. By 9 o'clock, the diner had emptied except for Sarah, who was wiping down tables with her usual thoroughness. She paused at Table 7, her rag hovering over the red vinyl. "Weird," she murmured. Memo's blood froze. "What's weird?" "This table's warm, like someone was sitting here." She pressed her palm against the seat. "But nobody's been at this table all morning. I would have noticed." The razor suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Someone had been watching, waiting. Close enough to heat the vinyl with their body, invisible enough to escape notice in a room full of people. Memo's 11-year illusion of safety crumbled like ash. They weren't just coming for him. They were already here. Memo's hand trembled as he reached for the coffee pot, the porcelain handle slick with his suddenly sweating palm. Probably just the heating vent, he managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. Sometimes the air circulation gets wonky in this old building. Sarah shrugged, accepting the explanation with the easy trust that small-town life fostered. She moved on to the next table, humming something under her breath. A Taylor Swift song, probably. The kind of music that belonged to a world where your biggest worry was a broken heart, not a broken cover. Memo watched her work, memorizing the way she tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the unconscious grace of someone who'd never had to look over their shoulder. In 2 hours, he'd become acutely aware of everything he stood to lose, not just his life, but theirs. All the innocent people who'd wandered into his orbit without knowing they were dancing around a loaded gun. The lunch prep gave his hands something to do while his mind raced. Chopping onions for the day's special, meatloaf with gravy, comfort food for a town where comfort was still possible. The knife work was meditative, precise, a skill that served him well in the kitchen, though he'd learned it in darker places for darker purposes. Some muscle memory never faded. "You ever think about leaving here?" Sarah asked suddenly, startling him from his thoughts. She was restocking napkin dispensers, her back to him, but he caught something wistful in her tone. The question hit him like a physical blow. Leaving. The word that had defined the first half of his life, always running, always looking for the next safe harbor. He'd thought those days were over. "This is home," he said carefully. "Why would I want to leave?" "I don't know." She turned, leaning against the counter with that particular restlessness of youth. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing here, you know? Like I could vanish tomorrow and the only thing that would change is who makes the coffee." Memo's chest tightened. She had no idea how prophetic her words were, how easily someone could vanish when the wrong people came looking. "You're not disappearing, Sarah. You're building something. The nursing program, your savings. I know. She waved him off, but her smile was grateful. "It's just, don't you ever miss the excitement? The unexpected?" If only she knew. Memo had lived on adrenaline and terror for so long that the quiet rhythms of Millfield had felt like resurrection. The predictability she found stifling had been his salvation, until this morning. "Excitement's overrated," he said. "Trust me on that." The bell above the door chimed, and Doc Mitchell shuffled in, bringing the smell of antiseptic and winter air. At 72, he was the closest thing the town had to a patriarch, delivering babies and patching up ranchers with equal skill. He'd been the one to set Memo's broken ribs during his second week in town. A fall down the stairs that was really the lingering gift of Miami enforcers who'd caught up with him in Phoenix. Afternoon, Marcus. Sarah. Doc claimed his usual stool, arthritic fingers already reaching for the sugar dispenser. Heard we might get another 6 inches tonight. Mrs. Patterson's hip is acting up something fierce, always does before a storm. The conversation flowed around predictable channels: weather, gossip, the eternal debate over whether the high school needed a new gymnasium. Normal talk for normal people living normal lives. But Memo found himself cataloging details with the paranoid precision that had kept him alive in Miami. Exit routes, sight lines, who was sitting where and why, old habits, survival instincts that 11 years of peace hadn't managed to kill. Dr. Mitchell was telling a story about his grandson's college adventures when Memo noticed the man at the corner booth. Not a regular. Memo knew every face in town, every order, every quirk. This guy was maybe 40. Dark hair, wearing a flannel shirt that looked too new, too carefully chosen to blend in. He'd ordered coffee and pie but hadn't touched either, just sat there reading a newspaper while his eyes tracked every movement in the diner. Memo's blood turned to ice water. Professional surveillance. The kind he'd been trained to spot in another lifetime, when knowing the difference between a tale and a coincidence could mean the difference between breathing and becoming fish food in Biscayne Bay. The man looked up from his paper, and for one terrifying second their eyes met. The stranger's face was utterly neutral, giving away nothing. Then he smiled, polite, forgettable, the kind of expression that would slide right out of memory. Except Memo never forgot a face that was trying too hard to be forgotten. The stranger dropped a $5 bill on the table, stood, and walked out. No rush, no drama, professional to the end. Memo's carefully constructed world was dissolving like sugar in rain, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. Memo forced himself to count to 30 before moving toward the corner booth, his legs feeling like lead. The newspaper lay folded on the table. USA Today, nothing local, nothing that would give away where the man had come from. The coffee cup still radiated warmth, and the apple pie sat untouched, a perfect wedge with the fork positioned just so. Too perfect, like a stage prop. "Everything okay, Mr. V?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from underwater. "Fine," he managed, though his hands were shaking as he cleared the table. Under the newspaper, pressed against the red vinyl, was a single business card. Plain white stock, no company logo or fancy printing. Just 10 digits written in blue ink. A phone number he'd memorized 23 years ago and tried desperately to forget. The DEA field office in Miami. Catherine Reyes's direct line. But Catherine was dead. Had been dead for over a decade. Memo had sent flowers to her funeral from a Safe Mart in Billings, signing the card with his real name for the first and last time since entering witness protection. She'd taken a car bomb meant for him. Everyone knew it, but no one could prove it. The card burned in his palm like a live coal. Someone was playing games, and the rules were written in blood he'd thought was long dry. "Doc, I need to run to the bank real quick," Memo called out, proud of how steady his voice sounded. "Sarah, can you hold down the fort for 20 minutes? "Sure thing." She was already reaching for the coffee pot, efficiency in motion. "Take your time." Memo grabbed his coat and stepped into the bitter February air, the cold hitting his lungs like a slap. Main Street stretched before him, postcard perfect with its Victorian storefronts and snow-dusted awnings. A Norman Rockwell painting where nothing bad ever happened, and the biggest scandal was who was sleeping with whose spouse. But the watchers were here now. He could feel eyes on him from somewhere, a parked car, an upstairs window. Maybe the man in the too new flannel shirt hadn't really left at all. The sensation crawled between his shoulder blades like insects. He walked toward the bank with measured steps, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. At the corner, he ducked into Patterson's Hardware instead, using the front window's reflection to scan the street. There, a dark sedan parked outside the post office, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. Someone sitting in the driver's seat, face obscured by shadow and tinted glass. Bill Patterson looked up from restocking screws, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Marcus, don't tell me that ancient furnace is acting up again." "Just browsing," Memo replied, positioning himself to keep the sedan in view. The driver wasn't moving, wasn't pretending to read or talk on a phone. Pure surveillance, confident and unhidden. They wanted him to know he was being watched. The phone number felt like it was radiating heat through his jacket pocket. He could call it, probably should call it. But what if someone answered? What if it was really Catherine's voice on the other end, impossible and terrible? Or worse, what if it was someone else entirely? Someone who'd been waiting 11 years for him to make contact. His burner phone, the one he'd never used but kept charged out of pure paranoia, was hidden in the diner's office. If he called from there, they could trace the location instantly. If he called from anywhere else in town, he'd expose whatever public place he chose. The smart play was to run, right now, clean out the emergency cash from his safe deposit box, take his truck, and disappear into the mountains before they could close whatever net they were weaving. But that would mean abandoning Sarah, Doc Mitchell, Sheriff Barnes, everyone who'd become real to him in ways his old life never allowed. They'd ask questions when he vanished. They'd worry. Maybe they'd even grieve. The thought paralyzed him. For 11 years he'd been Marcus Valdez, the quiet diner owner who remembered birthdays and made donations to the volunteer fire department. The man who'd helped Sarah through her father's funeral 2 years ago, who'd given Doc Mitchell a place to warm up during his late-night house calls. That man had friends, responsibilities, a life worth protecting. But Memo Valdez, the accountant, the money launderer, the federal witness, he was a ghost. A necessary evil who'd served his purpose and should have stayed buried. The sedan's engine revved once, deliberately. A signal, or maybe just a reminder. We're here. We're waiting. The choice is yours. Memo turned away from the window, his reflection fracturing in the glass like a broken mirror. 23 years ago, he'd made a choice to survive by destroying everything he'd ever known. Now he had to choose again. Protect the life he'd built by returning to the man he'd tried to kill. The phone number seemed to pulse against his chest like a second heartbeat, counting down to a decision that would damn him either way. Memo stood frozen in Patterson's Hardware, the business card burning against his chest while his reflection stared back from the window, fractured, distorted, like the life he'd tried so hard to piece together. 20 minutes. He told Sarah 20 minutes, and half of that was already gone while he stood paralyzed between two impossible choices. The smart move was running. Every survival instinct honed over decades of living on borrowed time screamed the same message: disappear before they could spring whatever trap they were setting. He had protocols, cash hidden in 3 different banks under 2 different names, a truck that could handle mountain roads in February, enough supplies cached in the national forest to last until spring. He could be gone in an hour, a ghost story by morning. But Sarah would notice when he didn't come back. She'd worry, maybe call Sheriff Barnes. Doc Mitchell would ask questions at tomorrow's coffee ritual that would never happen. For the first time in his adult life, people would miss him, not because they needed what he could do for them, but because they'd grown to care about the man he'd become. Marcus Valdez had friends. Memo Valdez had only ever had accomplices and enemies. "You feelin' all right, Marcus?" Bill Patterson's voice cut through his spiral. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The old rancher's weathered face showed genuine concern, the kind of worry neighbors showed each other in places where everyone mattered. In Miami, the only people who cared about your health were the ones planning to damage it. Just tired, Memo managed, forcing his body to move away from the window. "Haven't been sleeping well. Eleanor's got some of that chamomile tea if you want me to ask her for some. Knocks me out cold." Patterson's offer was casual, automatic. The kind of small kindness that happened a dozen times a day in Millfield, invisible gestures that had slowly taught Memo what normal people's lives looked like. The sedan was still there when Memo glanced back, patient as a predator. They weren't hiding anymore, weren't pretending this was coincidence. The message was clear: we found you, we're watching, and we're not going anywhere. His hands trembled as he picked up a random box of wood screws, something to justify his presence while his mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it wasn't about Griselda at all. Maybe the government had decided he knew too much about other operations, other players who were still breathing. The cartel money he'd helped launder had tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses, political campaigns, law enforcement agencies. Loose ends had a way of becoming liabilities when the wrong people got nervous. Or maybe someone had finally connected the dots between Memo Valdez, the federal witness, and Marcus Valdez, the diner owner. 11 years of careful construction could unravel in a single afternoon if the wrong database got cross-referenced. if some ambitious analyst decided to run facial recognition on small-town business licenses. The worst possibility was the simplest: Griselda herself. Federal prison wasn't the fortress people imagined, especially when you had the resources and connections of a cocaine queen. Orders could flow out through visitors, lawyers, corrupted guards. Money could reach anyone, anywhere, if you were patient enough and creative enough. And if there was one thing Griselda Blanco understood better than anyone, it was patience and creativity when it came to revenge. Marcus? Patterson was looking at him strangely. You've been staring at that box for 5 minutes. Memo blinked, realizing he'd been crushing the cardboard container in his grip. Sorry, my mind was somewhere else. I'll bet. You know, if something's troubling you, really troubling you, Doc Mitchell's not just good with broken bones. Man's got a way of listening that makes problems feel smaller. Helped me through some dark times after my Mary passed. The offer hit Memo like a physical blow. In his old life, problems got solved with bullets or bribes, never conversation. The idea that someone would listen without wanting something in return, that confession could lead to comfort instead of a shallow grave. It belonged to a world he'd never learned to navigate. But Doc Mitchell was 72 years old, with hands that shook when the arthritis flared up. Sarah was 23, with dreams of nursing school and a savings account that represented every extra shift she'd ever worked. Sheriff Barnes was a good man in a small town who'd probably never drawn his weapon outside of training. None of them were equipped to handle the kind of violence that followed men like Memo Valdez. The phone number seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, demanding a decision that would determine not just his fate but theirs. Call it, and he'd be admitting Marcus Valdez was a lie. Ignore it, and they'd escalate, whoever they were, whatever they wanted. In his experience, people who made grand gestures with antique razors and impossible phone numbers didn't simply give up and go home. Through the window, the sedan's exhaust continued to paint the cold air white. Waiting, watching, counting down to a choice that would destroy everything he'd built one way or another. Memo set the box of screws back on the shelf with deliberate care, his decision crystallizing like ice in his veins. The watchers weren't going away. Whatever game they were playing, ignoring it would only make things worse for everyone he'd come to care about. He'd learned that lesson in blood 23 years ago. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to walk willingly into the fire. Thanks for the advice, Bill, he said, proud of how steady his voice sounded. I think I know what I need to do. Patterson nodded, satisfied that he'd helped, never knowing he'd just witnessed the death of Marcus Valdez, small-town diner owner. That man was about to become a memory, another casualty of a war that never really ended. The walk back to the diner felt like a funeral march. Each step on the snow-packed sidewalk echoed with finality, the sound of a man approaching his own execution. The sedan tracked his progress, its occupant no doubt reporting his movements to whoever was orchestrating this resurrection of the past. By tonight, people in Miami, Medellin, maybe Washington, D.C. would know that Memo Valdez had surfaced. The diner's warmth hit him like an accusation when he pushed through the door. This was sanctuary, the closest thing to peace he'd ever known, and he was about to poison it with everything he'd tried to leave behind. "How was the bank?" Sarah called from behind the counter, her smile bright and trusting. She'd pulled her hair back into a ponytail, revealing the small scar on her neck from a childhood accident she'd told him about last Christmas. She'd shared that story like it mattered, like her past was something precious instead of something to escape. "Fine," he lied, hanging his coat on the hook by the office door. "Everything's fine," but his hands betrayed him, shaking as he reached for the coffee pot. Sarah noticed. She always noticed things like that. It was what would make her a good nurse someday, if she lived long enough to see that dream. "Mr. V, you sure you're okay? You look—" "I need to make a phone call," he interrupted, more sharply than he intended. "Private business. Can you watch the front for a few minutes?" Her expression shifted from concern to puzzlement, but she nodded. In the 11 years since he'd opened this place, he'd never asked her to cover for personal business during the day, never received calls that couldn't wait until evening. Marcus Valdez lived a life of scheduled simplicity, everything planned and predictable. The office felt like a confessional as he closed the door behind him. His emergency phone sat in the bottom drawer of his desk, nestled between a loaded .38 revolver and $20,000 in cash, the last remnants of his old life that he'd never quite been able to abandon. His hands remembered the weight of the weapon, the comfort and terror it represented. The business card felt impossibly light between his fingers as he dialed the 10 digits that had once been his lifeline to the federal government. Each number was an admission, a step backward into the darkness he'd crawled out of. The phone rang once, twice. "You took longer than I expected." The voice that answered wasn't Catherine Reyes. It was male, calm, with the kind of careful neutrality that came from years of intelligence work. "But you made the right choice." Memo's throat felt lined with sand. "Who is this?" "Someone who's been keeping you alive for the past 11 years. We need to meet." "We?" "The people who matter. Tonight, after you close. We'll be in touch with location details." The line went quiet for a moment, then, "Oh, and Valdez?" "Don't even think about running. We've got eyes on everyone you care about. The girl, the old doctor, even Sheriff Barnes. One wrong move, and they start paying for your sins." The connection died, leaving Memo alone with the magnitude of what he'd just triggered. No going back now. The hunters had found him, and the only way forward was through whatever trap they'd prepared. He'd made his choice, not to save himself, but to keep the people of Millfield from becoming collateral damage in a war they'd never signed up for. He slipped the .38 into his jacket pocket, the familiar weight both comforting and damning. Marcus Valdez, the man who solved problems with coffee and conversation, was gone. What walked out of that office was older, harder, a ghost returning to life to face whatever judgment awaited. The threshold had been crossed. The only question now was how many people would die before this was over. The rest of the day crawled by like a death sentence being carried out in slow motion. Memo moved through the familiar rhythms of running the diner, refilling coffee, taking orders, making small talk. But everything felt hollow, performative. He was an actor playing Marcus Valdez one last time, and the performance was killing him. Sarah kept shooting him worried glances. Doc Mitchell arrived for his usual afternoon coffee and lingered longer than normal, his sharp eyes taking inventory of Memo's pale complexion and trembling hands. Even the regular customers seemed to sense something off. Conversations felt stilted, smiles forced. The easy warmth that normally filled the diner had curdled into something anxious and uncertain. The sedan remained parked outside until 3 o'clock, then disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. But Memo could feel other eyes on him now, watching from different angles. A woman in hiking gear who nursed the same cup of tea for 2 hours while reading the same page of her book. A utility worker who spent an unusually long time checking power lines across the street. A trucker who kept glancing through the window while pumping gas next door. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. The message was clear: we own this space now, and everyone in it. At 5:30, Memo began the closing routine with mechanical precision. Sarah had left an hour early for a study group, but not before cornering him by the register. "Something's wrong," she'd said, her young face creased with concern that made his chest ache. "I don't know what it is, but whatever you're dealing with, you don't have to handle it alone. People here care about you." He'd wanted to tell her the truth then, wanted to explain that caring about him was the most dangerous thing she could do. Instead, he'd managed a reassuring smile and promised everything would be fine. Another lie in a day full of them. Doc Mitchell had been harder to fool. The old physician had planted himself at the counter as closing time approached, nursing his coffee with the patience of someone who'd spent decades reading people's pain. "Marcus," he'd said finally, "I've seen that look before. On soldiers coming back from places they couldn't talk about. On patients who'd received test results they weren't ready to hear. A man gets that expression when he's staring at something that's going to change everything." The temptation to confess had been overwhelming. Doc Mitchell had steady hands and a steady heart, the kind of man who might understand the impossible choices that survival sometimes demanded. But understanding wouldn't stop a bullet, and bullets were coming. Memo could feel them gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. "Just some business decisions weighing on me," he'd said, hating himself for the deception. "Nothing that won't sort itself out." Now, alone with the silence and the smell of cooling grease, Memo locked the front door and flipped the sign to "closed." The familiar routine felt like preparing for his own funeral. He'd built this life one careful day at a time, and now he was dismantling it with the same methodical precision. His emergency phone buzzed at exactly 7 o'clock. A text message with an address, the old logging road that wound up into the national forest, 5 miles past where the streetlights ended. Of course they'd choose somewhere isolated, somewhere the screams wouldn't carry. But as Memo grabbed his coat and checked the 38, one final time, he realized something had shifted in his thinking. The terror was still there, cold and familiar in his belly, but it was mixed with something else now, something that felt almost like relief. For 11 years, he'd lived with the constant fear that this day would come. He'd jumped at unexpected noises, analyzed every new face, rehearsed escape routes and contingency plans until paranoia became as natural as breathing. The waiting was finally over. Whatever happened next would at least have the mercy of certainty. The truck's engine turned over with a reluctant growl, protesting the cold and the late hour. As Memo pulled onto Main Street, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the side mirror, haggard, hollow-eyed, already looking more like the man he'd been than the man he'd become. Marcus Valdez was fading, bleeding away like warmth from a dying fire. The town fell away behind him as he drove toward the mountains, streetlights giving way to star-scattered darkness. In his rearview mirror, headlights appeared and held their distance, his escort to whatever judgment awaited. They'd probably been watching his truck since the moment he'd made the call, tracking his movements, ensuring he couldn't change his mind and run. But running was no longer an option. The rules of this new world were becoming clear. His past had patience, resources, and a very long memory. The only currency they might accept was his cooperation, and the only leverage he had was the knowledge locked in his head. Financial records, operational details, names and dates that certain people very much wanted to keep buried. The question wasn't whether he'd survive the night. The question was what he'd have to become to see another sunrise. The headlights in his mirror maintained their distance like a patient predator, neither gaining nor falling back as the road climbed into the forest. Memo's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his body remembering the hypervigilant state that had once kept him alive in Miami's cocaine wars. Every shadow could hide an ambush. Every curve might be his last. 38 pressed against his ribs with each breath, a cold reminder of who he used to be. Marcus Valdez had never fired a gun in anger, had built his life on the radical premise that problems could be solved without violence. But Memo had pulled triggers when necessary, had made calculations about who lived and died based on spreadsheets and survival. Tonight, those skills might be all that stood between him and a shallow grave in the Montana wilderness. The address led him to a turnoff barely visible in the darkness, marked only by a rusted Forest Service sign. His truck's headlights carved a tunnel through the trees as he followed the narrow track deeper into the woods. Snow clung to the pine branches like skeletal fingers, and the temperature gauge on his dashboard showed the mercury dropping fast. If they left him out here, the cold would finish what bullets started. After 2 miles of switchbacks and frost-heaved pavement, the road opened into a small clearing. A black SUV sat waiting with its engine running, exhaust ghosting white in the frigid air. No other vehicles were visible, but Memo's trained eye caught the subtle signs. Tire tracks in multiple directions, footprints already filling with fresh snow, the positioning that suggested overwatch from the tree line. This wasn't a meeting, it was an interrogation with escape routes cut off. He parked 20 feet from the SUV and killed his engine, letting the mountain silence settle around him like a shroud. Through the other vehicle's tinted windows, he could make out shapes but no faces. They were making him come to them, forcing him to take the first step toward whatever fate they'd prepared. The door handle felt like ice through his gloves as he stepped into the clearing. The cold hit him immediately, that bone-deep mountain chill that could kill an unprepared man in hours. But Memo barely felt it. His attention was focused on calculating angles, counting shadows, assessing threats with the automatic precision of someone who'd survived by never being surprised. The SUV's rear door opened with a soft click that carried clearly in the thin air. A woman emerged, tall, professional, wearing a black wool coat that probably cost more than most Millfield residents made in a month. Even in the dim light, Memo recognized the bearing of federal law enforcement. FBI, DEA, maybe something more specialized. The kind of person who spoke in euphemisms about national security and acceptable losses. "Hello, Memo." Her voice carried a slight accent, possibly East Coast, refined in the way that suggested expensive schools and government career tracks. "Thank you for coming. Did I have a choice?" He kept his hands visible but ready, every muscle coiled for sudden movement. "There's always a choice." She gestured toward the SUV's open door, warm light spilling from the interior. "But some choices have better outcomes than others. Shall we get out of the cold?" The vehicle's interior had been modified, plush seating arranged around a small table, sophisticated communication equipment built into the panels, the kind of mobile command center used for high-level operations. A second person sat in the shadows, male, younger, with the hard look of someone who'd done wet work in places that didn't officially exist. "Agent Patricia Voss," the woman said, settling across from him. "This is Agent Chen. We're with a task force that's taken a special interest in your situation." Memo remained standing, one hand near his jacket pocket. "Which situation would that be? The one where I testified against Griselda Blanco 23 years ago, or the one where I've been Marcus Valdez for the past 11 years? "Both, actually, and several others you're not aware of." Voss opened a manila folder, extracting a photograph that made Memo's blood freeze. It showed him walking into the hardware store that morning, but the image was crystal clear despite the distance and weather. Professional surveillance, the kind that took resources and planning. "We've been watching you for a very long time, Memo. Protecting you, in fact. Protecting me from what?" "From the people who put that razor on your table yesterday." Chen spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "The same people who've been hunting you since the day you disappeared from witness protection." The words hit like physical blows. Memo sank into the seat across from them, his carefully constructed reality crumbling with each revelation. "Witness protection said I was clear. They said Griselda's network was finished. We said what we needed to say to keep you functional." Voss leaned forward, her expression almost sympathetic. "The truth is more complicated, and as of yesterday, much more dangerous." The temperature inside the SUV suddenly felt arctic despite the running heater. Memo's hands went numb, but not from cold, from the realization that everything he'd believed about his safety, his new life, his careful redemption, had been built on lies. More complicated how? His voice came out as a whisper. Voss extracted another photograph from the folder. This one showed a woman Memo had hoped never to see again. Tall, elegant, with predator's eyes that had haunted his nightmares for over 2 decades. But the image was recent, the clothing contemporary, the background showing a Miami street he recognized. "Carmen Vega," Voss said. "Griselda's lieutenant, the one who was supposed to have died in that warehouse fire in 02. Memo's world tilted. Carmen had been Griselda's enforcer, her personal executioner, the woman who turned torture into an art form. She'd been the primary target of his testimony, the one he'd provided financial evidence against that should have guaranteed a life sentence. "The fire, I saw the reports. DNA confirmation. Falsified." Chen's voice cut through Memo's shock like a blade. "She bought her death for $8 million and a new face. We've been tracking her for 15 years, watching her rebuild what you helped us tear down." The straight razor, the engraving, the table placement. It all crystallized into a pattern of personalized terror that reeked of Carmen's theatrical cruelty. She'd always believed that killing was meaningless without the proper psychological preparation, that fear was more important than death itself. She found me. It wasn't a question. 3 days ago, we intercepted communications between her organization and certain elements in Eastern Europe. Your location, your identity, even photographs of people you interact with daily. Voss slid another image across the table, and Memo's heart stopped completely. Sarah. Walking out of the community college, books clutched to her chest, smiling at something off camera. The photographer had been close enough to count the freckles on her nose. "You bastards." Rage flooded through him, white-hot and purifying. "How long have you known?" "We've had assets monitoring Carmen's network since 2018, Chen said. When chatter about the accountant started surfacing in encrypted channels, we began taking a more active interest in your welfare." "My welfare?" Memo's voice cracked with fury. You've been using me as bait. 11 years of thinking I was safe, building relationships, caring about people, and you've been waiting for her to surface so you could catch her. The operation has evolved, Voss admitted. Initially, yes, we hoped your visibility might draw her out, but the situation has become fluid. She opened the folder wider, revealing a dossier that made Memo's blood turn to ice water. Financial records, shipping manifests, photographs of warehouses and laboratories scattered across 3 continents. Carmen hadn't just survived, she'd thrived, building an operation that dwarfed Griselda's empire. She's moved beyond cocaine, Chen explained. Fentanyl, synthetic opioids, chemical weapons. The razor on your table wasn't just a death threat. It was an announcement. She's ready to come home to Miami, and she wants to settle old scores first. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. You need me to testify again, to stop whatever she's planning. We need you to do more than testify. Voss closed the folder, her expression hardening. We need you to help us take her down, permanently this time. The word permanently hung in the air like a death sentence. Not arrest, not prosecution, elimination. The kind of off-the-books operation that left no witnesses and no official records. And if I refuse? Chen reached into his jacket, producing a tablet computer. The screen showed live surveillance feeds. Sarah leaving her study group, Doc Mitchell locking up his clinic, Sheriff Barnes making his evening rounds. All of them going about their normal lives, unaware that they'd become pieces on a chessboard where Memo was both player and prize. Carmen's already moving assets into position, Voss said quietly. She'll be here within 48 hours, and she won't come alone. Your choice isn't whether to help us, it's whether you want these people to die quickly or slowly. The SUV felt like a coffin, the forest pressing in from all sides. 11 years of careful distance, of building walls between Marcus Valdez and the blood-soaked world of Memo's past, had crumbled in minutes. The government agents across from him weren't offering salvation. They were demanding he become the killer he'd once been, but this time with official sanction. What do you want me to do? Help us set a trap, Voss said. Use yourself as bait. Carmen wants you alive. She has questions about certain financial accounts that disappeared when Griselda's empire fell. We can use that obsession against her. Memo closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's trusting smile, Doc Mitchell's concerned frown, the peaceful life he was about to sacrifice on the altar of his sins. When he opened them again, Marcus Valdez was gone forever. Tell me what you need. The plan had seemed elegant in its simplicity. Too elegant, Memo realized now as he crouched behind the overturned table in his own diner, blood seeping from a graze across his temple. The trap Voss and Chen had designed was supposed to be foolproof. Carmen would come for him personally, drawn by the promise of recovering the missing $23 million from Griselda's accounts, and federal snipers would end her reign before she could speak. But Carmen Vega hadn't survived 2 decades by walking into obvious ambushes. The first sign something was wrong had come at 3 a.m. when his emergency phone buzzed with a message that made his blood freeze. Change of plans. Come alone or watch your friends burn. You have 1 hour. See. The attached photo showed the exterior of Doc Mitchell's clinic, but the angle was wrong, too close, too intimate. Someone was inside. Memo had called Voss immediately, his hands shaking as he explained the deviation from their carefully scripted scenario. Her response had been coldly professional. Stick to the plan. Our people are in position. She's bluffing. But Carmen never bluffed. Memo had raced through the empty streets of Millfield, his truck sliding on black ice as he careened toward the clinic. The front door stood open, emergency lighting casting harsh shadows across the waiting room. He'd found Doc Mitchell tied to his own examination table, beaten but alive, a note pinned to his chest, the diner. 20 minutes. Come counting. Come counting. Carmen's old code for bringing exact payment, in this case, the account numbers and access codes she'd spent 2 decades hunting. The money memo had hidden so deep in the international banking system that even he wasn't sure he could retrieve it anymore. Now, 15 minutes later, his diner had become a war zone. Carmen's team had arrived first, turning his sanctuary into a killing ground with professional efficiency. When the federal agents finally moved in, they'd walked into a coordinated ambush that left 3 dead and the rest pinned down in the parking lot. 47 years old and still hiding behind other people's courage, Carmen's voice drifted from the kitchen, cultured and conversational despite the gunfire punctuating her words. I expected better from Griselda's favorite pet. Memo pressed deeper into his makeshift cover as bullets chewed through the diner's thin walls. Through the shattered front window, he could see muzzle flashes from the tree line where Voss's backup team was supposed to be providing overwatch. Instead, they were fighting for their lives against an enemy that had anticipated their every move. You killed my partner in Bogotá, Carmen continued, her footsteps echoing on the kitchen tiles. Carlos Mendez, remember him? 26 years old, planning to marry his girlfriend when you handed us those financial records. The words hit harder than the bullets. Memo remembered Carlos, young, idealistic, genuinely believing they were building something better than the violence that had consumed Colombia. He'd trusted Memo's assurances that the money was clean, that their expanded operations would move away from the blood trade. When the DEA raids came, Carlos had died trying to destroy evidence that Memo had already copied. He called my name when the bullets hit, Carmen said, closer now. Asked me to tell his Maria that he loved her. But I never got the chance, because your testimony put me in a hole for 8 years while she married someone else. Another burst of gunfire erupted outside, followed by screaming. Through the chaos, Memo heard Agent Chen's voice over the radio, coordinating a retreat that sounded increasingly desperate. The operation was falling apart, but Carmen wasn't interested in the federal agents. She wanted him. The accounts, Memo. $23 million plus 22 years of interest. Where did you hide my money? Your money? Memo forced his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his throat. That was blood money. Payment for murdered children. It was my retirement fund. Carmen's laugh was silk over razors. My ticket out of the life you dragged me back into. Do you know what I've had to do to rebuild what you destroyed? The people I've had to become? The question hung in the air like poison gas. Through the kitchen service window, Memo caught a glimpse of movement. Not Carmen, but someone else. Someone smaller, wearing the wrong clothes for a tactical operation. His heart stopped completely when he recognized the winter coat. Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway, her young face pale with terror, Carmen's pistol pressed against her temple. The college student who'd brought light into his gray world, who'd made him remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival, had become the final piece in Carmen's revenge. No, Memo whispered, the word torn from his soul. Cass, Carmen replied, her smile visible even in the dim emergency lighting. Now let's discuss those account numbers. And this time, pet, you won't have any government friends to save you. The plan hadn't just failed. It had become Memo's worst nightmare made flesh. Everything he'd tried to protect was burning, and the woman he'd once helped destroy was about to take the last good thing in his world. All seemed lost.